We started our discussion of Kohelet Perek Hey, which is really the centerpiece of the Sefer in many ways, because it is the first time we've introduced to the philosophy of the Arei Elokim of our four personalities. And the Arei Elokim is going to stay with us till the end of the Sefer. I'll already tell you in advance something which we'll highlight much later in the course, which is that each of the three that we have sort of antagonists to the Arei Elokim will modify their stance, will change their position, will take kind of opposite views, will navigate around where their philosophy leads them and ultimately write themselves out of the story. The Arei Elokim will remain consistent, which I would expect no less. From the Arei Elokim, and his position starts with a description of, we saw at the end of Perek Daled, the reference to the Beit Elokim. So somehow the temple, the avodah, the notion of the Beit HaMikdash becomes central to his message. And in that context, his message was Karov Lishmoa Mitei Taksilim Zavach, listening, understanding, following, obedience to God and to God's word. That's far more important than all of the sacrifices that you can bring in the Beit Elokim. I'm going to come back to that theme in a moment. And then continues in Perek Hey, and which is where we had focused, I think, last week on the phrase, we had focused last week on the phrase, where did it go? Where did it go? Yeah, if you see oppression, if you see violence, if you see the absence of justice and righteousness in the country, in the state, don't marvel at the matter. And there's that word chayfetz again, which we saw back in the words of the Nehene back in Perek Gimel. Ki gavoa me'al gavoa shomer u'gvohim alehem, because there is a partnership between God and the officials as they guard over them. There is this partnership between God and the Melech, between the Melech, Melech and the Melech Machei Melachim, and they will maintain that partnership through the world, whatever, and we'll come back to that as well. Then last week we talked a little bit about, I think that's more or less where we got up to, correct? Well, I think we talked about korbanot and the role of korbanot versus obedience was the theme we talked about last week. So what I want to do today is the beginning of Perek Hey, kind of go through the text and understand the basic themes and messages that now will pull all these themes together. On the one hand, the notion of obedience and loyalty to God as more important than the korbanot, which we talked about last week, as well as the sense of partnership, which is his conclusion, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. And now we are starting Perek Hey in earnest. Al tevahel al picha, v'libcha yemaher lotzi davar lifnei Elokim. Don't be rash, quick, b'hala. Don't be rash with your mouth. Don't let your heart be hasty, libcha ayemaher, to utter things before God, right? To say things before God. Ki Elokim b'shamayim v'ata ha'aretz. God is in the heavens, you are on the earth. There's an infinity between you. Al ken yudvarecha me'atim. Therefore, let your words be few. Let's make sure we are recording. Did everybody see a? Yes. Okay. Good. Ki ba chalom berov inyan. For as a dream comes with a multitude of ideas and words. It's talking about words here. Ken yudvarecha me'atim. When it comes to dreams come with multitude of ideas and words. The kol ksil berov dvarim, and in the multitude of words, is the speech of the fool. Right? Let your words be few. Kol ksil. The more you speak, the more. We talked a little bit about that phrase from Mark Twain. Somebody put it in the chat last week. I remember. Kasher tidor neder lelokim. Al te'achel l'shalmo. When you vow to God, don't defer payment of that vow. God has no pleasure in fools. If you pay, if you make a vow, pay up. Better not to vow at all than to vow and not pay. Don't let your mouth lead you to sin. And then don't protest before the messenger or the angel and say, oh, it was all a mistake, because you let your mouth lead you into sin. Why should God have to be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands as a punishment for all that you have done, because you let your mouth be rash and to lead your mouth and to lead you to sin? Dreams and vanities, multiple words, all themes we just had before. Fear God. That's where it's at. You don't talk too much. Don't talk too much. If you talk too much, it's hevel. It's vanity. If you dream too much, it's worthless words. That's all. You know what you need to do. Just do it. Fear God. If you see oppression, and then we got into that whole issue about gavoa me'al gavoa, and the rest of this discussion, which I'm going to leave now because the pasuk Zion is connected to what comes after it, and we need a separate discussion for that. So I want to focus on psukim Aleph through Hey today. And there are basically two primary themes that are highlighted in these verses. And they are connected, and we're going to connect them hopefully by the end of the shir today. But there are, in fact, two very distinct ideas that he is articulating, expressing, or talking about, and then we're going to have to figure out how they connect. The first, I think, is very easy to identify. The first thing he's talking about is, or one of the two things he talks about here is the concept of a neder, an oath. He says it in Psukim Gimel and Dalet very clearly. If you take a vow to God, don't defer it. Don't delay in paying it. God has no pleasure in fools. That which you vow, pay up. Better not to make the vow at all than to make a vow and not pay. That's one thing. And I'm going to come back. We're going to talk about that at the first part of today's shir. The second theme is speech. Speech which is rash, speech which leads you astray, speech which leads you to sin. Speech which is critical of God. Don't let your heart speak before God. God is in the heavens, you are on earth. Let your words be few. Or pasuk hey. Don't let your mouth lead you astray. Don't have to say, oh, it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice? Too much speaking is hevel and chalom. Fear God. That's what's important. So there's two basic themes to this passage. One has to do with speech, and the other has, particularly speech against God, and the other has to do with neder, with an oath. And we're going to connect them, obviously, because you take an oath with your mouth, right? And an oath is a vow and a form of speech. But I think he's talking about something much more dramatic. We're going to get to that in a second. But I first want to focus our attention on Psukim Gimel and Dalet. Just this for now. If you take a vow, and a vow, of course, in most contexts in Tanakh, a vow is a vow of a sacrifice or an offering, a vow that you commit to bringing to the Beit HaMikdash. That's the normal concept of a neder. Of a neder that you bring, you say, I'm going to take upon myself. There's an entire section of the Mishnah that talks about Harei Alai or Harei Zu, if you take a certain kind of oath to bring one kind of animal or another kind of carbon. What are your obligations? Don't tarry al bal ta'acher, don't delay. Is a prohibition against. Again, when the Beit HaMikdash stood, if you took an oath to bring a neder, you had up to 1 year to bring that neder. You couldn't be late. That which you vow, pay up. Better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. Okay. Here is leaving aside the korban issue for a moment, just in terms of a neder, let's call it an oath to God, and the payment of such an oath, however that translates. How many different kinds of people, or how many different situations are described in these two verses? I have somebody who vows and who doesn't pay. Right? Don't, if you take an oath, make sure you pay it, because if you don't pay it, you're in trouble. And the second is somebody who doesn't take the oath at all. Which, of course, if I had to put them in a hierarchy, what's better? To make a neder, I'm going to bring a korban, and then circumstances are such that you're unable to pay that oath. Or a person who means well, and he makes an oath, and he makes a pledge, and he makes a commitment, but he is, and then he is able to take that oath. Well, actually, no. The second category is somebody who doesn't take the oath at all. He says, "Listen, I don't make oaths, I don't make pledges, I don't make commitments. If I'm able to do something, I'll do it, but I don't make commitments." Of the two, the one who doesn't take the oath in the first place, or the one who takes the oath but who delays paying it, which is better? Well, that's self-evident.
Not to take the oath.
Right. Take the oath and pay it. It's better to not take the oath at all than to take an oath and not pay. What about a person who takes the oath, but who is able to pay it on time? Does he fit into these two verses?
He's kind of hidden in there. I mean, there's an implication.
Okay, and what's the implication?
He makes the neder and he pays.
And where does he fit in the hierarchy?
I'd put him on top.
Put him on top, right? It says it's better not to take the oath than to take the oath and not pay. What if you took an oath and paid?
Depends on the oath, doesn't it?
Well, let's assume for the moment we're talking about a pledge. In today's world, it's a pledge of money to a charity. In the Tanakh world, it's a pledge of a korban to the Beit HaMikdash. Is it better to take the oath and take the pledge and pay it? Or is it better not to pledge at all? Or better to take the pledge but not pay it? Which of the three is the best scenario of all?
Take the pledge and pay.
Right, make the pledge and pay. Which sounds reasonable and rational. Except, and then we start looking at the halachic sources, and these two verses are quoted often in halachic contexts, and we find something very strange. So we're going to jump to the source page, which you now should have available to you, and we find the following statement in the Gemara in Nidam. With an entire tractate of the Talmud devoted to these kinds of oaths. And the question that the Mishnah or the Breita there deals with is exactly my question. The verse says in KOHELET, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Tov mizeh umizeh she'eino nodeh kol ikar. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Better than both of them is the one who doesn't make the oath at all. That's the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, to which Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, what are you talking about? It's better to make the vow and pay the vow. Then you fulfill the mitzvah of Nedarim and you fulfill the mitzvah of paying up that which you pledged. Why should Rabbi Meir say that it's better not to take the vow at all? Says Rabbi Yehuda, I'd rather say that the best is to vow and pledge, is to pledge and pay. That's the machloket. So the question that I asked isn't a random question. It's actually embedded in this debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And based on the verses that I just showed you, Pasuk Gimel and Daled, I would have to argue that of these two verses themselves, the pshat of these two verses, I think lies more in line with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda than the opinion of Rabbi Meir. It's best to vow and pay, but if you can't, better not to vow at all than to vow and not pay. I think that that's understood by all, correct? The question is, where does
You're
Rabbi
assuming
Meir?
that there's good. You're assuming that there's good that comes from the vow.
Correct. Correct. I mean, the vow, in the simplest sense, we're talking about a vow of a korban to the Beit HaMikdash. Person says, "I'm going to take." I'm using a simple example. We'll make it more complicated in a minute. But for now, a person says, "Okay, I'm going to bring an extra korban to the Beit HaMikdash." Says Rabbi Meir, that's a terrible thing to do. Even though the Torah says you can do it, and even though there's a halacha Mishnah that says you can do it, and even though there's a mechanism to do it, says Rabbi Meir, no, better not to take the vow at all. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and he says, wait a second, what are you talking about? The verse clearly states, better to not to vow than to vow and not pay. But the implication is, Tov mizo mizeh nodero mishalem. I think that's a straightforward way of reading this debate. Similar kind of statement in Nedarim Chabet, similar but in a different place in the same tractate. We have the statement of Rabbi Natan who says, "Hanoder ki'ilu bana bama." If a person takes an oath to bring a korban in the Beit HaMikdash, it's as if they have built an altar outside of the Beit HaMikdash, which of course is prohibited. And if you fulfill the oath, meaning you bring the korban you took an oath to bring to the Beit HaMikdash, it's as if you brought the korban outside of the Beit HaMikdash. That's really an astounding statement, because bringing a vow outside of the Mikdash is prohibited. But taking a vow and to bring a korban to the Mikdash and then to do so is a mitzvah in the Torah. Somebody has a question. I see a hand raised.
Hi, I do.
Yeah.
At which point are we going to bring in the person who vowed to bring as a korban to God the first thing that came out, that came towards to him when he goes home, and it was his daughter?
Yiftach's a very strange story. It's not really relevant to this discussion at all, because what we're discussing here are not prohibited vows, but permissible vows. Yiftach is...
It wasn't prohibited. It was stupid, but...
It was stupid and it was prohibited and it was I'm not even sure he meant it that way. Yiftach is a very complicated story. We could talk about Yiftach, but we'd have to devote a whole shiur to it separate from this discussion.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's relevant to Kohelet. If you want to send me an email, I'll send you a link to a shiur I gave on the story of Yiftach. It's recorded on the show website. I'll be happy to send you a link. But I don't believe... Yep. Okay. You should have my email. I'll put my email back in the chat just in case anybody needs it. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Not only is Rabbi Meir's position surprising because of the text of Kohelet, and he bases it on the text, he bases it on a strange reading of the text, but when we look at the Shulchan Aruch in terms of how we rule, how we paskin between these two opinions, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, the Shulchan Aruch paskins very clearly like the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as surprising as that may sound. And the Shulchan Aruch writes the following: it's in the Code of Jewish Law, Al tehira gil ben nedarim, a person should not be accustomed to making vows. That's why you see very often people, that's why Kol Nidrei, Yom Kippur starts with Kol Nidrei, and Rosh Hashanah starts with the annulment of vows. And you'll hear people say, you'll do something but bli neder, right? We are very attuned to not making vows. That's this idea. Kol hanoder, if you take a vow, even if you fulfill it, af al pi shemekaymo, nikra rasha v'nikra choteh. Person is called evil and he's called a sinner. And then in Sif Gimel, it goes on to say, if you make a vow, and the vow here, we're talking about bringing a korban to the Beit HaMikdash, right? And then you have a Mikdash, so you bring that korban, Says Rabbi Natan, quoted in the Shulchan Aruch, "Ki'ilu ban habama b'shat isur habamot." It's as if you built a prohibited altar outside of the mikdash, and even if you fulfill that oath, it's as if you brought that korban on that altar. Ki'ilu ikriv korban. Shetov yoter sheishal al nidro. It's better to annul oaths than to have to fulfill them. And that's assuming, says the Shulchan Aruch, that we're talking about non-mitzvah related oaths. But if the neder is a neder of kodesh or mitzvah, then then of course you have to fulfill it. Nonetheless, it's better not to take the oaths in the first place.
So what I see is emphasize that we are not in control of circumstances. Never promise anything because you don't know what's going to be the next day or next minute.
That's very good. That's very powerful, and I want to bring it back to the text because I think that's exactly where he's going. So that's a very powerful observation, and I want to bring it back to the text. And so we're going to start with the question of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the one who says, based on this text, Toba Shalot Tidor, from this text, Rabbi Meir derives that it's better not to take an oath at all. And my question was why? Because the text itself seems to imply the opposite. Verse 4 states, better to not to vow than to vow and not pay. Says Rabbi Meir, it's better over both not to vow at all. And the answer, I think, is that Rabbi Meir is looking not just at these two verses, but at the broader context of this entire passage. Because that's the question I kind of dropped at the beginning of the discussion, which is what's the connection between the neder, the oath in verse 3 and 4, and the mouth, the words in verses 1, 2, and 5. Go back to 1, 2, and 5. Al tevahel apicha. Don't be rash with your mouth. Don't let your mouth be hasty. Don't speak before God. Let your words be few. If the words we're talking about are in fact somehow connected to the oath, then really his message is don't take oaths. Just stay away from them altogether. If you take an oath and you have to pay it, so pay it. So be it. Better not to take the oath at all than to take the oath and not vow. But better also, don't let your mouth be rash. Don't be quick. Don't sin. Don't have to say it was a shkaga. So when I look at the broader context of these 5 verses altogether, there is a message of keep your mouth shut. Not even in the context, it's a mitzvah to make a neder, but nonetheless, you're better off. Right here, he's not talking about not fulfilling the oath. He's talking about don't speak before God. Al tevahel apicha. Let your words be few when you stand before God, because God is in the heavens and you are on earth. The voice of the fool is the one who speaks a multitude of words, who speaks and speaks and speaks and doesn't say anything of substance. Like a dream, hevel havalim. So there's the connection here, I think, is very powerful. Now, there's a historical connection and there is a theological connection. This historical connection, if I leave out the neder of the role of the mikdash for a moment, the historical connection, again, he's speaking to the Amal and he's speaking to the Neheneh, and he's speaking particularly to the Amal, who says that he's in charge and he's the Melech and he's going to fix the world and he's going to change the world and he's going to promise that he has the ability to bring Mishpat into this world. And if you see the evil in this world, the king is responsible for fixing it. And KOHELET correctly turns to this Amal and he says, you're a fool. You can talk and talk and talk, but you're a fool. Why? Because how many times can you promise things and not fulfill them? I mean, look at the author of KOHELET, right? Assuming Shlomo HaMelech, and the story of Shlomo at the end of his life and his anticipation that Yerovam, his son, Yerovam, Rechavam, his son, and the rebellion of Yerovam around the corner. How many times is the king in a position where he sees all kinds of issues in the world and he says, okay, we're going to fix it all? And KOHELET says, well, who are you to think you can fix it all? You really believe that you have the ability, that you have the power to fix the world? You're here on earth, God is in the heavens, and you think you can fix it all? Al tevehel apicha. Don't be rash. A little humility might do you some good. Ki Elokim hashamayim v'ata ha'aretz. Al ken yidvarecha me'atim, therefore let your words be few. Only the fool speaks in terms of promises that they can change and fix the world. Come back to the neder in a second. Don't let your mouth lead you to sin. So there's an element of a very historical context of that comes back to the Amal in Perek Daled that we talked about. But then there is a theological issue here, and the theological issue of the Yirei Elokim. And I didn't catch the picture of who was it who just said what they said, but I think that there's a very profound truth to that sentiment, namely that there's a theological lacking in emunah in the very process of the oath itself. Even if you have the ability to fulfill that oath, even if you have the ability to fulfill that promise, there is a theological lacking in the moment you utter the oath in the first place. And I'll show you where I think it comes from. A very powerful observation. Gemara in Sota says, Rabbi Eliezer Gadol Omer, Kol mi sheyesh lo pat besalo, v'yomer ma ochal lemachar, eno ela miktanei emunah. A person has bread in his basket. When he has money in the bank, bread in his basket, he says, I have what to eat today. And then he says, but what am I going to eat tomorrow? That person demonstrates a lack of faith. He's called miktanei emunah, from the small of faith. What does that mean? So most understand this to mean that he's securing what he has today, but he questions whether God will provide something for him for tomorrow. And that's the lack of faith. But there are those who suggest, and I heard this from the grandson of the Sfas Emes in a very powerful sikha, there are those who suggest that the Ktanei Emunah is not because he questions what he's going to eat tomorrow. That's a fairly normal reaction response, right? If a person has what they have today, they have to worry about tomorrow. The Ktanei Emunah is mi sheyesh lo pat besalo. He has bread in his basket. And he assumes, therefore, that the only question left is, what will he eat tomorrow? Meaning, he's quite confident that what he has today is his. And so his only question is, what's it going to be with tomorrow? But he's called Miktanei Emunah because who said that you can be so certain about that which you are going to eat or have or do or fulfill today? Who says that we have the ability to be so confident in that which we have already achieved that we shouldn't lose it? A very profound observation. That we have to worry not just about what we think tomorrow might bring, but also that which we've already achieved, that we shouldn't lose it. Like the verse in KOHELET in Perek Chet that says, En shilton b'yom hamavet. At some point or another, we lose control. That which we have today, we think we can consume, we think that's in our control. Person makes a neder, person makes an oath. He thinks that they are completely in control of their world to the point that they can make an oath that they will take that which they have in their backyard and they're going to bring that to the korban and they're going to bring that to the mikdash tomorrow. You think that between the time you take the oath and the time you go back to your house, there couldn't be something that could happen that could make that impossible to fulfill? Yes, there's the story of Yiftach out there, but leaving even that without that, even assuming his neder is 100% legitimate. But the fact that he has the arrogance to think that he is in control of the world even in that which he has already accomplished, that's a religious arrogance that needs to be addressed. And so KOHELET says to him, if you take an oath, you speak, you say, I can do it. I have the power, I have the wealth, I have the resources, I have the ability, I have the accomplishments, I have the whatever it is. You think you can do it? Because what? Because you don't think God is in control? God is in control. You are on earth, and God is in the heavens. You think you run this world? The Amal in his entirety, the entire world view of the Amal was that he runs this world. It says Kohelet to the Amal, you think you run this world? Remember, he's responding directly to the Amal. God runs this world. We have a responsibility to fear God, to follow his command, to follow his guide. But we don't run this world. And that will lead us to that partnership we talked about a couple of weeks ago. There's a very powerful, I wasn't sure with the of time, but there's a very powerful connection to the world of the neder. What's the connection between the notion of the neder, the oath, and the notion of building a bama? Building a bama is something which you're not allowed to do, right? You're not allowed to build a mikdash out of the temple. The bama is an altar that you build outside of the temple. Why are you not allowed to build an altar outside of the temple? Because the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that when it comes to the notion of religious observance or avoda or service, when it comes to the context of religiosity of theology, we are not the determining factor in what that religious expression is supposed to be. And if I go to Dvarim Yud Bet, this is a little bit of background, but just the Gadol, let me just explain to you the context. There is an understanding of the book of Dvarim, that the book of Dvarim from chapter 5 till the end is structured along the lines of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments that are articulated in chapter 5, the Aseret HaDibrot, then are elaborated upon over the course of the remaining chapters of Sefer Dvarim. You understand what I'm referring to, great, and if not, it's okay. It's not critical for our understanding of Kohelet, but basically his message, if you look at the Parshiot of Vatchanan and at the beginning of Eikev, he's talking about idolatry and the prohibition of idolatry and the prohibitions of the requirement of Anochi and Lo Yelecha, right? The idea of loyalty to God and only to God, and not embracing other gods or other idols. In Parshat Re'eh, he expands on something else, which is the notion of the place that God chooses, Hamakom sheyivchar Hashem, l'shaken shmo sham, l'sum shmo sham, to place his name there. And the third of the 10 commandments is lo tisad shem Hashem elokecha l'shav, not to take God's name in vain. And so that connects to that third, and then the end of Parshat Re'eh is Shabbos, which connects to Yantif and Shemitah, and we can go on. The rest of all of Sefer Dvarim more or less is structured along the lines of the Ten Commandments. But I'm particularly interested in this notion here in Dvarim Yud Bet, because it talks about the fact that when you come into the land of Israel, what you will find is that the nations who are there built altars and built temples on every high place and on every hill. You shall destroy all the places that the nations of the world built. All of their altars and all of their temples that they built on every high mountain, on every hill, and under every green tree, everywhere. They wanted to have a religious experience, they built an altar. They wanted to bring a korban, they would build an altar. They wanted to express something in religious terms, they would make a neder, they would build an altar, and that's the connection to the oath, and they would do what they want. Says the Torah, no. Those altars have to be broken down. L'shem Elokechem, ki im al makom sheyivchar Hashem Elokechem mikol shiftechem lasum et shmo sham, to place his name in that place which God will choose. And the remainder of this chapter all talks about bringing the olah and the zevach and all of the various offerings that the Torah sets out. We are obligated to bring them to the temple, which is the place where God will choose to place his name there. Even the place is chosen by God. We are not in control of how God can, right? That comes back to what we talked about last week with the notion of the korbanot. When the korbanot are by God's divine, by God's command, by God's choosing, by God's orchestration and structure. We don't determine what it is that God wants us to do. That's making God in our image instead of the other way around. We are loyal to that which God commands and instructs us to do in our observance of the Torah and the laws. We fear God, not the other way around. And so we don't build altars wherever we choose, but rather, Makom Sheyivchar Hashem. Says Rabbi Natan, that's exactly what the concept of a bama is. A bama is an altar that one builds outside of the temple because they choose to build this altar where they want, and God says no. So even if you take an oath to bring a korban, and even if you fulfill that oath, that korban is driven, that oath is driven not by God's command, but by our command, our instruction. Says the Torah, that's not the whole idea is to be loyal, to say little and do much, meaning to say little in terms of what you think you are in control of and can do in this world, and to say and to do much in terms of what God wants and tells us to do in this world. Two fundamentally different perspectives. Okay, that explains the concept of a neder. However, in the context of this chapter in Kohelet, Kohelet has added an additional character or nature to the words that we speak. They're not just an oath to bring a korban and bring the korban to the mikdash, and then he says, listen, God has enough korbanot, he doesn't need us to decide that he needs another one. Right? But here it's much more profound. And if we look at it from the perspective of, now let's go back to the broad context. What kind of speech is he talking about in verses 1 and 2? Al tevehel al picha. Don't be rash with your mouth. Don't let your mouth utter something before God that you will regret. God is in the heavens and you are on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few. What dream comes the multitude of cares, a fool's speech, the multitude of words. What kind of words is he talking about? What kind of words take the form of an oath that Kohelet says, and now let's leave the korban world of the Mikdash for a second and expand it, that Kohelet says, be careful what you say. Don't let your mouth trip you. Don't take the arrogance to think you are in charge. Who is he speaking to and what kind of words is he talking about? Where he says, be careful, God is in the heavens and you are on earth. Your perspective is limited. Let your words be few. Be careful what you say. He's talking to the Amal. What kind of words is he referring to that he's so critical of? And he says, you know what? When you come to the temple, karov lishma, keep your mouth shut and listen. And don't talk. Talk too much. I don't think it's random words or random oaths. I think it's very specific.
Is he talking about a melech, a king?
It can be.
Okay, who thinks a lot and makes a lot of edicts and.
Right. You can certainly be talking about a king and who makes promises and edicts and rules, etc. You could be talking about a leader, right? You could be talking about, but he could also be talking about the random you and me. Because what I think he's talking about is not just words of an oath, but words that are critical of God. Remember, the major theme of this book is to address the question of how does evil exist in the world? How does Tov and Ra exist in this world? Go back to the themes of the Sefer, and we'll come back. Right? We have to remember that we've been dealing with the micro. Let's go back to the macro for a second. And in the context of the existence of evil of the world, the Neheneh came along and said, you know what? God is in control. God will do everything. I don't have to worry about it. And the Amal came along and said that which borders on heresy and says, if God is in control, I don't want to live in this world anymore. If the tear of the oppressed without anybody to take care of them is what you've defined as God's world, then that's a world in which I'd rather not be. And so the Amal turned and said, I'll take all the responsibility for this world. It's on my shoulders. We're going to fix it. Comes along the Yirei Elokim and he says, watch what you're saying. You speak less. Because you're talking about God. You're talking about a critique of God. We're talking about the Elokim b'shamayim etal haaretz. You are on earth. You are human. You don't see the perspective that God sees. You cannot see everything. You think you are in control? That's the arrogance we talked about before about the neder. You think you're in control? You think you can promise to fix this world? You think you can do a better job than God? I would be very careful before I uttered those words that I can do a better job than God. Because that's exactly what the Amal said. And that was precisely what Kohelet responds to. And he says, you think you can do a better job than God? You know, we know somebody in Tanakh who thought he could do a better job than God. We do. We know somebody in Tanakh who thought he could do a better job than God. Anybody know his name? I'll cheat. Okay? That was the story of Job. The story of Job is the story of a man who, for chapter after chapter after chapter, critiques God because of the hardship of his life and because of the challenges and the tragedies that he undergoes. And at the end of the day, he have 39 chapters, or 37 chapters, if I take out the first two, which is the story, of Eov criticizing God, 39 chapters. You want to talk about rov dvarim, words that are expensive, right? Be careful, let your words be few. 37 chapters, Eov rails against God. And with an argument that God doesn't let him speak and God doesn't come and respond to him, and God is silent, and all this silence and all of this evil is rampaging around the world. Finally, God comes to him at the end of the book. And after Eov has, for all of these chapters, railed against the concept of theodicy and the righteous who suffer, and where is God in this world, and why we allowed this evil to exist. After 37 chapters, 39 if you include the first two, finally in chapter 40, God comes to Eov and he answers him. Vayan Hashem et Eov vayomah. What is God's answer? So let's take a look. Let's take a look. What is God's answer? I'm just going to read a couple of psukim. Vayan Hashem et Eov min hase'ara vayomah. God answered Eov out of the whirlwind and said, Ezor na ki gever chalatzecha. Gird your loins like a man. Esh'alecha. I have a question for you. Hodieni. You answer me. After mishpati, will you make my judgment void? Tashi'eni leman titzdak, will you condemn me so that you can be justified? Im zroa ke'el lach, have you an arm like God? V'kol kamo ta'em, can you thunder like God? Adeina ga'on v'gova, deck yourself with majesty and excellence, v'hod v'hadar tilbash, and array yourself with glory and beauty. Hafetz evrot apecha, cast abroad the rage in your wrath. Let's see you take everyone who is proud and bring them down to humility. Let's see you take somebody who's proud and bring them low, and tread the wicked in their place. Let's see you do it. Hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in hidden places. If you can do this, I will confess to you, your right hand can save you. You want to run the world? Go ahead. Let's see you do a better job than me. If you can do a better job than me, go for it. I'm not sure what kind of an answer that is to Eov. But then God says something even more astounding. Take a look at the behemoth, this big, giant, primordial prehistoric animal. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in his loins. His force is in his belly. His tail extends like a cedar. And the sinews of his thighs are knit together. And he goes on to describe he's the beginning of the ways of the power of God. Or a little bit further, he says, Timshach Leviathan b'chaka. Can you draw out the Leviathan with a fishhook? B'chevel tashkil l'shano, or press down his tongue with a cord? Hatasim magamon be'apo. Can you put a ring in his nose? V'chot tikov lechyo, or bore his jaw with a hook? Will he make supplications to you, this Leviathan? What is he talking about?
He's just saying that God is stronger.
He's saying that God is.
That's it.
He's saying that
There
God.
has to be something more than that.
I didn't hear what you one word in your answer got lost. He's saying that God is what?
Stronger.
Stronger. Okay.
There has to be something more.
But that is not the question. The question is not whether God is stronger. The question is whether God is just. Correct? Eov spent 39 chapters describing the issue of evil in this world. And to say to Eov, wait a second, where were you when I created the world? Do you think you can do a better job? Gesundheit, here are the keys. Go for it. Why is that an answer? What is the behemoth and the Leviathan? What is this pre-creation Leviathan? What does that mean? What is this fish that consumes all? And that why is it a symbol of the answer to Kohelet? Sorry, to Eov. So I think the answer, and this is very important, the answer in the Leviathan and the behemoth lies not in the power to subdue them, but in the nature of what they represent. What they represent is unbridled evil. Let me say that again. What they represent is unbridled evil. Here's an example in Habakkuk, what we would call evil, unjust, unfair. Right? In Habakkuk, in Parak Aleph, he describes Pasuk Yud Bet. You are everlasting. God, you have appointed Mishpat Samto, you have appointed man to judgment. You, Rock, have established man to be punished. You have pure eyes to see evil. And you look away instead of looking onto mischief. Why do you tolerate those who are rebellious and treacherous? Why are you silent? When the wicked swallows up the other that is more righteous than he. Habakkuk starts his book with exactly the same question that Eov does. Adam kidgei hayam, turning man into one who is like the fish of the sea. Kiremes lo moshelbo, like a creeping things that have no ruler over them. What is it about the fish of the sea that makes this argument that God looks away? So in the critique of God looks away when one swallows another, when the rebellious swallow the righteous, when man acts like the fish of the sea. That's exactly what the Leviathan represents. The fish of this is this great big fish that opens up its maw and swallows all the other fish in the sea whole. without the question of who's righteous and who's not righteous, and which fish deserve to die and which fish don't deserve to die. The Leviathan, this animal, this fish of the sea, or in the case of the behemoth, it opens up its mouth and just swallows the Ge'ayam. That's exactly what the wicked do in the world. B'vala rasha tzadik mimenu, says Habakkuk. Says God to Eov, Gesundheit, you think that it's so easy to subdue the Leviathan? Go for it. Why is that an answer? Because ultimately, I come back to the question, or to the clip that I played you from Rabbi Sachs a couple of weeks ago. The question is not whether or not you can subdue wicked, and bring justice into the world. The question is whether you can do so within the context of a world of nature, and the context in which man still has the freedom to choose. That's the problem. God can be all powerful, but if you leave, in order for him to create the human being, evil in this world is created by man. Man swallows another man. So if you take away man's free will, what have you done with creation? That's the answer to Eov, right? You want to run the world, but you take away man's free will. Go ahead, but that's not the way I created the world. I created the world, an all-powerful God who created the world with the ability for the human being to have the freedom to choose right, to choose wrong, to choose good, and to choose evil. The question is, where is man? And to Kohelet, that's exactly the same answer. The Amal comes along with grandiose promises and grandiose perceptions. I can control the world. I can do better. I can bring justice into this world. Really? Says Kohelet. That's exactly what Eov claimed. And where did it get him? Ultimately, the message is, we'll come to the partnership, right? Ultimately, you're not absolved from responsibility, like the NS says, because you throw the responsibility for the world onto God's shoulders, but nor are you all powerful. You have the freedom to choose to good and evil. That's the way God created this world. Atala Aretz. God is in the heavens. You think you can do better? You want to critique God? Be very careful. And that's the connection between the neder and the dvarim that he speaks about in chapter 1, I think, is exactly this message. Don't be rash. Don't think you are in control. Don't think that you can claim, like Eov, I can do a better job than God. Ultimately, you need to partner with God and to observe and to obey what he has instructed us. But right, if we think we have such critique, right? Let me put it into terms equal to or relevant to a human being. Okay, a person in political leadership. The world is engulfed right now in political elections, left, right, and center. Okay, so the first step in a political election is you critique the existing regime or the existing administration, and then you promise that you can do better. Right? That's how elections work. You think you are? Imagine for a moment that these four personalities, the Amal, the Nana, the Yareh, and the Chacham, are running for election. Not so far-fetched, because we'll see the Chacham spends half his time complaining about why he's not running the world. Not such a far-fetched analogy. Comes along Kohelet to the Amal, and he says, you want to critique the one who's running the world? You want to critique God? And then what? And then you're going to promise that you can do better? The arrogance of the Amal is off the charts. That's exactly the arrogance that Kohelet is referring to here. And so the combination of these two ideas, number one, that you are not in control of this world, you have a role to play, but you're not in control, and ultimately God is in control. That's the two combinations of the be careful with your words, that your words of critique be few, because you don't see what God can see, and you don't have the power that God has. And at the same time, don't bring the oath, the neder, the assumption that you think you can do better. Don't let your mouth trip you into thinking that you are perfect. And then ultimately, when you understand that this has to be a partnership between man and God, you are not absolved like the Nene, nor are you all responsible like the Amal, then you bring those two elements together, you get this pasuk Zion, which leads us into the remainder of the story, which is Ki gavoa mi'al gavoa shomer. Don't walk away. You have a role, but you're not in control. And that is I think that's how the pieces of this parak come together. All right, I will stop here for a moment, and if there are questions, comments, observations, let's take a moment now to take a look at the chat if there's anything.
Since you brought
Yeah.
up Eov, his question started with why am I suffering? Why am I being punished?
Correct.
The answer that you gave doesn't answer this question.
Oh, no, for sure not. For sure not. The whole point of Sefer Eov is that he doesn't get an answer to the question.
Yeah, but the answer
That's not-
was
that's
that
not-
the of sheep, you can't eliminate injustice.
I think the answer is exactly the same answer Kohelet articulated in one sentence. God is in the heavens, you are on earth, let your words be few. There are things we don't have an answer to. Now, that's a somewhat unsatisfying response, but we will fine-tune it as the Sefer goes along. But I think Kohelet, in many ways, is a direct response to, or alternative picture than the one that Eov presents. Eov presents a very practical solution. Eov comes away with this, his question is not answered. His question is not answered. All that he's told at the very end is that in order for him to change his worldview, he has to leave himself and care about others. Soloveitchik talks about the final chapter of Eov, essentially that God returned or restored Eov to his previous position when he learned to pray for others. When it wasn't about himself, but it was about others. The very end of Eov. And that's also an answer of sorts. It's not a theological answer. It's a practical answer. In the end of Vashem, in the end of Eov, Parak Membet, Vashem shavet shvut Eov behitpalelo ba'ad re'eo. God changed the fortune of Eov when he learned to pray for his friends. When it wasn't about him, but it was about others. That's a different answer. In Kohelet, he's going to address the question on a theological level. Do we have the power? It's not about whether we have the right to question God, but do we have the power to be better than God? That's the question. And you want to question God? Okay, God says, can you do better? Says Kohelet, it's a partnership. You want to partner with God. God has left you a place to have a role in this world. He's created this world for you to have that place. Somebody at the beginning of this year mentioned the story of creation, right? Creation starts with that partnership, for sure. God commands Adam and Chava and puts them in the Gan Eden and says, I've given you this world, Lovdao L'Shama. There's a partnership here. That partnership is what Kohelet is kind of alluding to and will get to, and where it leads him in terms of how we address this world. It's a practical answer, not a theological one. So that's also an important distinction to make. All right. So we have one more piece of the, and the Yarei Elokim is taking us a few more weeks more than I had anticipated, but it's very important. We have one more week, one more session on the Yarei Elokim, which is to understand what this partnership is about. May not take us a whole year, so if we don't, we'll continue on to the next piece as well. But if you have any questions or want to reach out to me by email, please don't hesitate. And I think I will.
Now, though, I have a question now.
Yes, please.
Given what you're saying, and I understand the whole thing about the neder and taking on an unnecessary task, but how does any future planning to say, well, next December of 2024, I want to go to Florida, I want to go to Israel and volunteer, that puts all that kind of future planning in doubt and an act of hubris.
For sure.
Other than maybe I'm going to prepare lunch now of schnitzel and potatoes, you know.
So I come back to the partnership. You know the expression "man tracht and Gott lacht," right? Man plans and God laughs. We plan and we plan and we plan, but the most you know the expression, you know the answer. What's the religious expression that we address that we use to express or to address this issue? Whenever we plan, Bezrat Hashem, if God wills it. Meaning we embed into our speech two phrases which we throw out routinely, but that are a reflection of exactly this sentiment. One is that everything we do, Bezrat Hashem, God, I'll plan for tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem. Hopefully, God willing, I will be there. And the other is Bli Neder. The other is I take things without, I do things without an oath. Meaning, both of those sentiments are reflected in the theology of this chapter. That the partnership is that we do whatever we can to plan, but we recognize theologically, it's a profound recognition that from the smallest to the biggest, God can change those plans.
But we still have to plan.
So,
I mean, a temple is a multi-year endeavor to build. And there's a lot of
that's the partnership
with it. But we still want to do it.
That's the partnership. Correct. That's the partnership.
And I'm reminded of the Midrash about when Solomon, or was it Solomon or somebody who captured the evil inclination, and no eggs were laid and no people built houses. So when you take away man's hubris, you get nothing being done in the world also. So Solomon blinded the Yetzer Hara, so it wasn't quite as powerful.
So let me qualify the Midrash you're referring to. It's not about Solomon. It's about the Second Temple period. It's about when they returned from the exile of Babylon, and they realized that idolatry was ultimately the cause of all of their issues. They asked God permission to remove idolatry from the world. And the Medrash said, the Gemara in Gemara, I believe is in Yuma, that God gave them the Yetzer Hara for idolatry, and in so doing, they were able to subdue it. But the conclusion of that same passage, this is really for so much more broader, I'll just on short, the conclusion, says the Vilna Gaon, was they recognized that they lost something when they lost idolatry. And what they lost was prophecy. Second Temple period is also the end of prophecy. And that's exactly what I think you're saying, right? There's an energy, there's a drive, you call it a hubris, but there's a drive to have a relationship with God and to come close to God. And if it's in God's terms, it's called prophecy and Torah. If it's on man's terms, it's called idolatry. But the bridge between them is very narrow. And so there's a risk. So we were willing to forego that. And it's a very famous passage, but it connects to what we're talking about in terms of Kohelet's message. Kohelet's message is don't give up the drive, just channel it. It's a partnership. You have to listen to God's side of the equation, and we have to plan, and we have to know that whatever we aren't successful at, God has a different plan. Right? That's the partnership. That's what we're going to talk about. 100%.
Excuse me. Are you equating prophecy to the lion that left Kodesh HaKodashim, or is there something followed further down in the Gemara I'm not familiar with?
It's all part of the same Gemara. It's all part of the same story. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says that it's the Navi who identifies that lion is the power of prophecy, and it comes out of the Holy of Holies because that's the source of prophecy that we talked about before, and that ultimately it's the same prophets who identified the lion who tell them that that's the story. Yeah, that's exactly the same passage. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. I'm going to adjourn here. If you didn't follow that conversation about the Gemara and idolatry, etc., don't worry about it. We'll have another opportunity to unpack that Gemara. I'm sure it'll come up. But for now, have a wonderful day. And
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Next week. Take care.
Thank you.